There is a version of you that everyone respects, but no one actually sees. They see the patience, they see the calm, they see the person who shows up, listens without judgment, gives without asking, and holds space for everyone in the room. They see the empath, the one who cares the most, feels the most, sacrifices the most. But here is the thing no one tells you. That version of you has been your greatest prison. Not because caring is wrong, not because feeling deeply is a flaw, but because somewhere along the way, the sensitivity that was supposed to be your strength became the mechanism through which people drained you, and you let it happen because you didn't know there was another option. Until now. What I'm about to walk you through is not another list of empath tips. It is not a spiritual pep talk. It is a psychological process, one that some researchers, philosophers, and depth psychologists have been tracking for decades. And it fundamentally changes what kind of person an empath becomes when they stop running from their own power. I'm calling it the quiet, lethal stage. And the empaths who enter it become almost impossible to manipulate. Stay with me because the shift I'm going to describe in the next few minutes is not comfortable. It is not easy. And the final piece of it, the last thing that happens when this process completes, is something most people in this niche have never dared to say out loud. Let's start with who you were before. Think about the first time you realized you felt things differently than other people. Not louder necessarily, but deeper. You could walk into a room and feel the invisible weather of it, the unspoken tension between two people who seemed fine on the surface, the sadness underneath someone's joke, the anger hiding inside someone's silence. You felt it before you had words for it. And for a while, this felt like a superpower. You understood people in ways they couldn't understand themselves. You became the person others came to, the confessor, the listener, the one who could sit with someone's pain without flinching. And you were praised for it, celebrated for it, defined by it. Here is the psychological trap that was being set without your knowledge. When a behavior gets rewarded early in life, the brain encodes it as an identity, not just a strategy. You stopped being a person who chose to be compassionate. You became compassion itself. You fused with the role. And once that happens, any threat to the role feels like a threat to your survival. The moment you said no, even once, there was a spike of anxiety. Not because the situation was actually dangerous, but because your nervous system had been conditioned to treat your own refusal as a violation of your identity. You weren't just disappointing someone else. You were betraying who you believed yourself to be. This is the trap. And right now I want to ask you something that might be uncomfortable to sit with. How many times have you agreed to something you didn't want to do and told yourself it was kindness when actually it was fear? Fear of being seen as cold. Fear of losing someone's approval. Fear of the silence that follows when you finally say what you actually think. Most empaths, when they hear that question, feel a quiet recognition in their chest. Because deep down, they already know. The emotional scientist is what some psychologists call the fully realized empath. The one who has crossed through the process I'm about to describe. And before we get there, I need to explain what Jungian analysts call the shadow. Because this is the engine behind everything that's about to change. Carl Jung spent decades studying the hidden architecture of the human psyche. And one of his most important discoveries was this. Every human being carries a second personality. The parts of themselves they were taught were unacceptable. The traits that got punished, rejected, or shamed in early life. These traits don't disappear. They go underground. They form what Jung called the shadow. Now here is where it gets interesting for empaths specifically. The traits most commonly buried in an empath's shadow are not what you'd expect. It's not cruelty. It's not aggression in any destructive sense. The traits an empath buries are these: assertiveness, selectivity, anger, the ability to say, I don't care about this, and, most powerfully, the capacity for strategic thinking. Why strategic thinking? Because from a young age, many empaths were shown that calculating behavior was manipulative behavior. Planning how to handle someone, thinking 3 steps ahead in a conversation, using emotional intelligence as a tool rather than as an automatic response. These things felt cold, even to themselves. So they rejected them. And this rejection is precisely what makes an untrained empath vulnerable to people who have no such rejection. The narcissist, the emotional manipulator, the chronic user. These people have fully integrated their strategic capacity. They plan, they test, they observe, and they do it naturally, effortlessly, while the empath is still in the reactive mode, still responding to each moment with their entire nervous system. This is the asymmetry that exhausts empaths for years. But here is what changes, and here is the shift I want you to pay attention to. The quiet, lethal stage begins at a specific moment, not gradually, not through therapy alone, not through a meditation retreat. It begins at the moment the empath, for the first time, consciously turns their perceptual accuracy inward, not toward someone else's emotional state, but toward their own psychological patterns. Let me paint you a picture. Imagine an empath, let's call her Maya, who has been in an exhausting friendship for 3 years. Her friend, let's call him Daniel, is charming, intelligent, and chronically struggling. Every few months, Daniel has a crisis, and every few months, Maya shows up. She listens, she helps. She gives her time, her energy, her advice, her emotional bandwidth. She tells herself this is what real friendship looks like. Then one day, Daniel cancels plans with Maya when things are going well in his life. He's busy now. He's thriving now. And Maya notices something strange. When Daniel is doing well, he goes quiet. When Daniel is struggling, he calls. She had noticed this before, but she had explained it away, rationalized it. Told herself he was just overwhelmed, just dealing with a lot, just not great at communication. But on this particular day, something is different. Instead of rationalizing, she pauses. She sits with the observation, not the emotion of it, but the data of it. And she realizes, with a cold, clear certainty, this isn't random. This is a pattern, and I have been participating in it for 3 years. That pause is the beginning. That moment of shifting from emotional absorption to psychological observation. That is the quiet lethal stage beginning to form. Because once you can observe the pattern without immediately collapsing into the emotional reaction to it, you have created something powerful. You have created distance. And distance is the ingredient that changes everything, because you can't make a clear decision from inside a flood. Now here is the part of this that most content in this space gets wrong. They frame this shift as becoming cold, becoming guarded, becoming someone who stops caring. That is not what happens. What actually happens is more nuanced and far more powerful. The empath does not stop feeling. The feeling remains. The difference is that the feeling is no longer the only voice in the room. It gets a seat at the table, but it no longer runs the meeting. That role shifts to something else. Call it discernment, call it psychological clarity, call it the part of you that finally learned to observe rather than immediately react. Here's the functional difference. Before the shift, someone says something that triggers you. The emotion fires. The response follows almost instantly. You defend, rescue, apologize, or accommodate, depending on which version of the empath trap you're caught in. The other person has essentially pressed a button and watched you respond predictably. After the shift, someone says something that triggers you. The emotion fires, and then there is a pause, a beat, sometimes just 2 seconds, in which you observe both the emotion and the person in front of you simultaneously. In that pause, you ask, what is actually happening here? What does this person want from me? What is the smartest response, not just the most emotionally honest one? That pause is not suppression. It is not coldness. It is a skill, and it is one of the most psychologically sophisticated skills a human being can develop. Behavioral analyst and body language expert Chase Hughes calls this the controlled emotional response, the ability to experience an emotion fully without allowing it to dictate your behavior automatically. It is the difference between a person who reacts and a person who responds. Manipulators, narcissists, chronic users, they are extraordinarily good at triggering automatic reactions. They use guilt, urgency, confusion, and emotional escalation because they know that when someone is emotionally flooded, their critical thinking shuts down. The brain prioritizes the emotional threat over everything else. The quiet, lethal stage closes that vulnerability, not by making you emotionally unavailable, but by making you emotionally intelligent in a way that is genuinely dangerous to anyone who is relying on your predictability. Let me tell you what this actually looks like in practice, because the theory matters less than the behavior change. When someone attempts to guilt trip an empath in this stage, they notice it. Not defensively. They don't feel immediate anxiety. They don't rush to defend themselves. They don't spiral into self-examination, wondering if the guilt is valid. They notice it the way a diagnostician notices a symptom. Calmly, with interest. And they decide, deliberately, whether to respond and how. When someone tries to create urgency where none actually exists, the classic, "I need your answer right now" manipulation, the empath in this stage feels the manufactured pressure and labels it. They don't move faster. They often slow down, because they know that artificial urgency is a harvesting technique, and they have stopped being harvestable. When someone uses the silent treatment, emotional withdrawal, or sudden coldness as a punishment mechanism, the empath in this stage does something that confounds the manipulator completely. They do nothing. Not because they don't care, they do, but because they recognize that entering the anxiety loop, chasing the approval, trying to repair what they didn't break, this is exactly what the behavior was designed to trigger. And they refuse to play the game. This refusal is what makes them quietly dangerous. Not because they become controlling or aggressive, not because they fight back in any conventional sense, but because every manipulation technique depends on the target being unconscious of the technique. Once the target is conscious, the technique fails. Every time, without exception. And here is something I want you to sit with for a moment, because this is where the real psychology lives. Shadow integration. The Jungian process of reclaiming the traits you buried is not about becoming someone new. It is about becoming someone whole. The integrated empath also stops rescuing. This is perhaps the most significant behavioral change, and it is also the most uncomfortable for the people around them. Because the rescuing was not just about helping, it was the foundational transaction of several of their most significant relationships. When the rescuing stops, the relationship has to find new ground or reveal that there was nothing beneath the transaction that could hold it. Most people experience this as the integrated empath pulling away or changing. They are not wrong. The empath has changed. They have stopped offering a service that was never actually their responsibility to provide. What they offer instead is something rarer and more valuable. Genuine presence. Unperformed. Unstrategic. The kind of attention that only becomes possible when you are not simultaneously running 3 background processes about how the other person is going to react to you, what they need from you, and how you can prevent the thing that might be coming if you don't get ahead of it. Now I want to ask you something specific, and I want you to sit with it rather than answer it immediately. When was the last time you responded to something in a relationship? A conflict? A disappointment? A moment where someone showed you who they were, and your response came from that still internal place rather than from the automatic mechanism? Not the urgent repair attempt, not the preemptive accommodation, not the performance of understanding. The actual, considered interior response. If you've had that experience, if you know what that feels like from the inside, then you are somewhere in this passage. Perhaps at the beginning of it, perhaps further along than you think. Perhaps standing right at the edge of the specific shift that changes the fundamental texture of every relationship you have from this point forward. And if you have not had that experience yet, if every response still feels automatic, if the guilt still arrives before you have time to evaluate whether it is accurate, if the need for approval still runs faster than your own perception, then what I want you to hear is this. That is not a statement about who you are. It is a statement about where you are. And where you are can change. Has changed, in fact, for every person who ever arrived at the place I have been describing. Not through a decision made one morning, but through the slow, honest, genuinely difficult work of being willing to look at every part of what you are without flinching. The most integrated empaths are not the ones who felt the least. They are the ones who felt everything and refused to let what they felt be used as a leash. They learned to carry their full interior without being carried away by it. They discovered that the same sensitivity that made them absorb everything could be redirected. not outward by default, but inward first, as a source of information about what was real, what mattered, what deserved their extraordinary capacity for care, and what did not. And they found out, on the other side of everything that passage requires, that the life that becomes available to a whole person is so much larger than the life available to the edited version. Not louder, not more defended, larger, with more room in it for actual connection, the kind that happens between two complete people who are both fully present, rather than the kind that happens between someone giving and someone taking, and both of them calling it love. Here's the question I want to leave you with. And unlike most questions at the end of a video, this one is not about what you have already achieved. It is about what you are willing to do next. The shadow you have been avoiding, the anger, the needs, the limits, the parts of you that feel incompatible with the version of yourself you have been maintaining. What would change if you stopped avoiding it? Not if you expressed it indiscriminately, if you simply stopped being afraid of it, if you let it into the room of your own self-awareness and found out whether it is actually as destructive as you've been told, or whether it is the missing piece of the person you've been trying to become. Most people who feel deeply have spent years being afraid of their own full range. Afraid that if they let the anger surface, it would destroy something. Afraid that if they expressed a need, they would be too much. Afraid that if they stopped being the accommodating one, there would be nothing left of themselves worth staying for. The answer to those fears is not a concept. It is an experience. It is the specific, irreplaceable experience of sitting with the thing you were afraid of and finding out that you survive it, that it does not destroy you, that in fact, it is the thing that makes you complete. When an empath integrates their shadow, they reclaim their assertiveness without guilt. They reclaim their anger, not as something to weaponize, but as accurate, functional information about where their limits are. They reclaim their strategic mind, the capacity to think clearly about social dynamics without feeling like that clarity makes them cold or calculating. And here is the paradox that most self-development content misses entirely. The more fully an empath integrates these traits, the kinder they actually become. Why? Because the kindness is no longer driven by fear. It is no longer a performance. It is no longer a strategy to avoid rejection or maintain approval. It becomes genuine, chosen, deliberate, offered freely rather than compulsively. An integrated empath gives from fullness. An unintegrated empath gives from emptiness and calls it virtue. The difference between those two types of giving is not just philosophical, it is behavioral, and people around you can feel it, even if they can't articulate it. The empath who gives from fear radiates a kind of anxious openness that functions like a signal to certain types of personalities. Come here, take from me. I will not stop you. Not because I don't want to stop you, but because I don't know how. The empath who gives from integration radiates something entirely different. Warmth that has edges. Openness that comes with parameters. Generosity that does not require you to disappear yourself. This energy is not cold, but it is not exploitable either. And this changes the quality of relationships the empath attracts. Here is something important that behavioral science confirms repeatedly. The relationships in your life are not random. They are the precise result of what you signal, consciously and unconsciously, about what you will and won't tolerate. Your behavior, particularly your boundaries or lack of them, trains the people around you. This is uncomfortable to hear, but it is one of the most liberating truths in psychology. Because if the relationships in your life reflect what you have trained others to expect, then changing what you tolerate changes who shows up. The empath who enters the quiet lethal stage begins to see this clearly. They stop asking, why do I keep attracting the same kind of person? Because they know the answer. They were signaling availability. They were broadcasting tolerance for dynamics they secretly resented. And certain types of people are expert at reading those signals. Once the signals change, the field changes. Now let's talk about the final piece of this, the thing I promised you at the beginning. The part that most people in this space never say out loud. The full realization of the quiet lethal stage requires grief. Not anger, not empowerment monologues, grief. Because when you finally see clearly, when the pattern becomes conscious, when you understand the role you played in the dynamics that exhausted you, there is a loss. The loss of the self-image you built. The loss of the identity that felt like goodness but was actually survival. The loss of the story you told yourself about the people who drained you, because the story requires you to be the purely innocent one, and integration refuses that simplicity. There is grief for the years spent giving from the wrong place. Grief for the relationships that were built on a version of you that was performing rather than living. Grief for the energy spent managing other people's emotions at the cost of your own. This grief is not weakness. It is the price of becoming real. And here is what's on the other side of it. An empath who has grieved that loss, integrated their shadow, and developed the psychological skill of responsive rather than reactive engagement, this person is not just harder to manipulate. They are, in the truest sense, free. Not free from feeling, their sensitivity remains, often deepens, but free from the compulsion to use their sensitivity as a currency to purchase approval. They care, but they care honestly, selectively, with their eyes open. They give, but they give deliberately, from choice, not from fear. They listen, but they listen as someone who knows the difference between a person who needs support and a person who needs an audience for their chaos. This is the version of you that has always been trying to surface. Not a colder version, not a harder version, a whole version. One that can hold warmth and clarity at the same time without those two things competing. And here is the question that I want to leave you with. Not a rhetorical one, but a real one that deserves your honest attention. When you picture yourself without the compulsion to be endlessly available, endlessly patient, endlessly understanding, what is left? If the answer feels frightening, that's important. It means your identity has been more fused with the role than with the person underneath it. If the answer feels like relief, like space, like breath, like something you haven't felt in a long time, that's important too. It means part of you already knows what you're capable of and has been waiting for permission to step into it. You don't need permission. The quiet lethal stage is not something that happens to you. It is something you choose, in the moments where you pause instead of react, where you observe instead of absorb, where you finally decide that your sensitivity deserves a protector. And that protector is you.